So hello everyone. For several months now actually, I've been posting these videos on my YouTube channel all about this big piece I'm doing. I got a grant to fund part of the project, and we have arrived at a point where I'm going to have to kind of take a break from updating you on what's going on. At this point, we're into choir rehearsals and recording sessions and a lot of film editing. I am going to shoot some video while the team is doing all of that work, and I will put together some videos about all of that part of the process, but it's a little too disjointed for me to kind of, make a video about this and then make a video about that, because it's, going to be all kind of spread out all over the place for the next couple of months. We're shooting for a end of April. Finish this project. It's a film with a music score all about an important NASA mission. Now, the other element of this is that once I start putting together videos about the next parts of the process in putting this piece together, you will start to hear samples of the music and see parts of the film and things like that. And there are, of course, some legal issues to deal with, copyright protections and permissions that I have to set up before I start, putting things like that out into the public. So I thought we would take a look for the next several videos at some other projects that I'm doing that are indeed directly related to my original music and will ultimately affect the live performance of the piece I'm working on right now. And, the thing is, I am a big believer in live music. I am not, I know there's a lot of people who do music that only exists in the studio environment, and I think that's fine, but that's not for me. I like to create things that I can go out in front of an audience and perform live. My music primarily uses pipe organ sounds. However, those sounds are augmented and manipulated through effects processing, through multi-track looping, and all of this other kind of stuff. And so those things, which are fairly easy to do in the studio, there's some complication to that when trying to perform it live. And especially when one is trying to use pipe organ sounds as the primary tone source for their music, performing it live when it's augmented like that is a little tricky. First of all, I can't actually perform my original music on an actual pipe organ. The reason is that a pipe organ is a big spread out thing. The tone sources are all over the place. When I first conceived of how I was going to do this music and was going to do all of these looping and augmentations and things and echo effects, I mic'd up a pipe organ at a church I work for occasionally, and tried to set up effects processing and all of that. I thought that might be interesting, at least for the studio recording. And it just turned into kind of a nightmare. It turns out that the inside of a pipe organ is actually kind of a noisy environment. And so not only was I looping and adding delay effects and massive reverbs and things to the beautiful sounds that those pipes were producing, I was also augmenting the sound of the mechanism, the whir of the blower, the clunking of other parts and components that go on when you're right up close to a pipe organ. If you're listening to a concert of a pipe organ out in the room, you don't hear all of those things. But when you try to put microphones in up close, it becomes an issue. So the solution for me to do my original music live and have those authentic pipe organ sounds is to use, of course, some kind of digital organ system. And I thought about initially, well, could I just get a digital organ and set it up and do my music that way? And yes, you can do that. Most digital organs are built for a church or institution environment, and they're not very portable. So then I decided to try out using a software program that goes on the computer, and that program was developed by a company called Milan Digital Audio, and it's called Hauptwerk. And what it does is what a lot of digital organs do. It uses samples, little recordings of the actual organ pipes, and then when you hit the key, that particular recording is played back. That's the simple version of it. Hauptwerk was also designed to work directly from MIDI. MIDI is a communication system, a digital communication system that was designed in the 1980s. It's going on 50 years old, and it is still in use because it was so well thought out. There is a quirk, however, and that has led me to the decision to start making my own MIDI controllers. There's several little details about how Hauptwerk works, how MIDI works, that I run into several problems with in live performances. So when the designers of MIDI were working on the system, they were thinking about the kinds of things that were being done in electronic music. And they weren't necessarily thinking that MIDI would be asked to operate a computer-based pipe organ emulator. And so there are distinctions with how the organ evolved and how synthesizers and electronic instruments evolved that do run kind of smack into each other, and we do have some interesting issues. So a typical MIDI keyboard setup, I might have over on the upper part of the keyboard, I might have a nice piano sound, and then on the left side of the keyboard, split at a certain point, I might have a bass guitar sound, and then I can noodle away with a little bass line going, and then I got my melody and stuff going on up here. That's called a keyboard split. MIDI does that beautifully. The other thing you can do is layer. All right, so maybe I want to play the piano, and I got a big lush grand piano sound, and I want it to sound like some strings in an orchestra playing along with me. So I can layer those together, and as I'm playing, I've got this lovely piano sound going, and I've got some strings in underneath that, and gosh, doesn't that sound like fun? So now let's talk about how a pipe organ works. Well, on a pipe organ, you have divisions, and so that's why on a typical pipe organ you might see 3, 4, even 5 keyboards, and then you have a set of bass pedals, and each of those divisions has maybe a dozen or more stops or different voices. On a pipe organ, you never really play like 1 or 2 voices at a time. It's always combinations of stops that are put together to generate the various effects that we're familiar with. So if we think of adding stops to the soundscape, that's kind of like layering on a MIDI setup, but not really, because we'd have to layer dozens of things together, and that doesn't really work in MIDI. Hauptwerk, the designers of Hauptwerk, built their system to be able to respond to MIDI instructions, but then it has to do a certain number of things on its own inside of itself. So you will assign the keyboard to run a division, and then all of those stops will be available. But changing stops is where I've run into some interesting problems. Because again, I'm not just changing one stop at a time. I'm changing combinations of stops all at once. Now, I can do that from here. A MIDI controller will do that. This one will send out 4 different groups of MIDI messages all at once. And so I can, for example, tell Hauptwerk that the presets, say I have a set of 100 different stop combinations that I've set up, that those are going to respond to program changes on channel 14. Well, then when I want to change from one stop setup to the next, I can just change to the next preset on the keyboard. Now, it sends everything at that point. You know, it sends out all of the control changes I need, everything for, you know, the FX processors, the looper, and the stop rail in the Hauptwerk emulator. And that works fine. With one exception. Of necessity, because everything's changing all at once, if I'm holding down keys and I press my foot switch to go to the next preset, this keyboard sends an all notes off signal. And that is so that we don't lock notes up because they haven't received a notes off signal. So MIDI has to work that way because it's thinking, oh, I was over on this sound module here and he hit the button, so now he's going to be over on this sound module over here. We don't want the sounds on this module to freeze up and get locked in that position. And that's not an issue in Hauptwerk because it's functioning like an organ. The stops change and it doesn't matter whether the keys are on or off when the stops change. And when you're playing the organ, sometimes you hold down keys and make a group of stop changes and the sound just changes while the notes are playing. So that has led me to create my own MIDI controller that is designed specifically to run Hauptwerk. This keyboard, which was my main controller keyboard, now is put in the upper position as the secondary keyboard. So it's going to do less. It will still control my effects processors and other devices, but it will not be asked to control Hauptwerk. Everything in Hauptwerk, the organ emulator, is going to control like an organ from an organ keyboard. So on organs, we have these buttons down here that are called pistons. And on a typical organ, each of these pistons will call up a group of stop changes that I have assigned to each of these pistons. I have other controls. These are for moving different memory levels. I've got 10 preset pistons available at any one time. With these buttons, I can move up and down in a group of over 1,000 pistons, and I can have 10 of those available at any one time. I can turn everything off. If notes do get locked up, I have an all notes off function, and so on and so forth. So when I'm playing organ sounds, I will primarily be playing them from here. I will still have my second keyboard when I need a second keyboard for depending on what I'm doing. But the organ, which is in the computer, will be controlled in its usual way, and that way it'll behave like an organ. This will still tap into the organ sounds secondarily, but this now will also give me the ability to expand the sound palette that I'm using in my original music. So for the next bunch of videos, we're going to be looking at how I'm going to turn a keyboard that I pulled off of an organ that I scrapped, and I made this custom piston rail, and we're going to look at the various ways I can turn this into a MIDI controller that is specifically for running an organ emulator in a computer. We're also going to look at some other MIDI controller projects that I'm doing on actual organs, and we'll talk more about that when the time comes. We're also going to take a look at a custom control panel I've made that is both MIDI and switch controls and processors that sits on the floor, and take a look at that. So next time we're going to look at an organ that I'm getting ready to convert to MIDI and why I'm doing that, and what that's all about. There was a viewer question, he was watching an older video of mine and wanted to know how tone generators work, and we'll talk a little bit about that on that video. So for now, that's what's happening next. This is my live performance rig. It is always being updated and modified and improved upon so that I can keep up with the music that I make in the studio and always be able to perform it live. Thanks for joining me today, and we'll see you next time.